Well, here we are again for another episode.
Yeah, here we are again. All right,
And
so we got some stuff lined up, and a lot of stuff has happened on that side of the world where you are, I think.
It has actually. So one that's probably not a bad place to start is the Prime Minister of New Zealand has resigned. So this is actually kind of interesting because in our Westminster system, it's often the case. So unlike in the presidential system where your president is elected for a fixed amount of time, and unless they're impeached, they're in office until the end of their term. But that's not how Westminster systems work in general. So the Prime Minister can lose the confidence, or the government can lose the confidence of what's called the confidence of the House. Basically, that's actually, it probably sounds more sort of fancy than it really is. All it is actually is that the opposition usually moves a motion in the House saying they've lost the confidence in the government. And if it passes, then it's official. They have the government falls, that's an indication basically that the government can't muster the votes in order to protect themselves from a motion of no confidence. That's often how Westminster governments fall in a Westminster system, or you might have a leadership challenge where somebody, the Prime Minister, this is something that has shocked a lot of people even who live in Westminster-style countries, where the government can stay the same, but the Prime Minister can change. Now, I would actually argue this is kind of a feature of the system, because if you've got a Prime Minister that sucks and the government, you don't necessarily want a full election just to replace that Prime Minister, and the government can decide to turf that Prime Minister out and replace that person. So that's actually what happens a lot of the time. And there's often a lot of very ambitious senior politicians who are sort of circling, it's a bit like sharks circling, looking for a weakness in the Prime Minister and then, coming in and taking them out. Here in Australia a few years ago, it was a bit of a joke actually. We were moving through Prime Ministers a bit quickly. We actually had a couple of Prime Ministers that sort of came back. So we ended up with one guy, then there was a woman, and the same guy was back, and then the woman was back. So it can sort of work against us as well. But that's not what's happened in New Zealand. Jacinda Adern is the Prime Minister of New Zealand, a Westminster system similar to the UK, Australia and Canada and other countries like Jamaica. But in her case, she has simply announced that she's resigning. Now, this does sometimes happen, but what I would suggest is happening is that the sharks were circling, just like is normally the case. However, she's decided to preempt, and rather than lose the prime ministership in a leadership challenge, she has decided to resign and then hand over the reins to someone else, and then just sort of step out gracefully. But what's interesting about this is that Jacinda Adern was the Prime Minister during COVID-19.
Yeah.
Yep, and there was really a very, very severe lockdown in New Zealand. From what I understand, people were very, very limited in their ability to move or even leave their house and so forth. We had that too, to a certain extent.
Yeah.
But my assessment of it is that we didn't, in general, because Australia, as I've explained before, is a federal system, and there are different states and so forth, and each state took their own approach. One state, Victoria, was really hard with their lockdown, but a lot of other states weren't. And I think we did nearly as well as New Zealand in terms of containing the virus at a much lower cost, if I could score that, because our lockdown was much less severe in general than in New Zealand. So I think it's a case. My sense is it's a case of diminishing returns.
I see.
And a lot of people feel that a lot of the commentators are saying now that sort of the chickens are coming home to roost, as it were. That the cost of that lockdown is really starting to become apparent to New Zealand now. And she's decided to step down at this moment, perhaps before the full cost has become apparent.
I see. Yeah, it's kind of something that I was really curious about because of how proximal New Zealand is to Australia, and I didn't know if it's something that is especially noteworthy of attention for Australians there.
I think it is. So Australia and New Zealand have I was almost tempted to say special relationship, but that term applies specifically to the UK-American-US relationship. But Australia and New Zealand have a very close relationship. There's actually something called the Trans-Tasman Travel Arrangement. That's an agreement between the two countries, which means that most citizens of one of the countries can simply move to the other and live and work there. So you just get a visa on itself. A New Zealand citizen coming to Australia just gets a visa on arrival that says they can live and work in Australia indefinitely. Currently, New Zealand citizens in Australia cannot ever progress to, or most of them can't progress to become citizens eventually. They're kind of like permanent temporary workers. And the problem, there's a bit of a problem with that because they can be here 10, 20, 50 years and basically still be treated as temporary workers. So there's the government's currently working on a plan to sort of give them a path to citizenship, which I think is the right thing for New Zealand citizens who've been here for a long time. In contrast, Australians who moved to New Zealand become permanent residents on arrival if they want and can eventually become citizens within a few years. So there's a special relationship. Well, there you go, I said it. There's a special relationship between the two countries. A New Zealand minister was once asked, because in New Zealand, actually, New Zealand considered becoming part of Australia when Australia was being formed. And it's actually mentioned in the Australian Constitution that New Zealand is actually mentioned as a possible colony that could become part of Australia. And a senior New Zealand minister was actually asked about the possibility of becoming part of Australia, just probably back in the 80s or 90s. And his comment, I thought was great. He said, we've got most of the advantages and none of the disadvantages of being an Australian state. So, yeah, they have basically free access to the Australian market, but they're still an independent country. Now, having said that, I'm not very happy with some of the directions that New Zealand has taken in recent years. I think there are some concerns. So I do think that it probably is good that the two countries are separate, even though they maintain this very close relationship. And by the way, I think it's about 25% of New Zealand citizens live in Australia. So there's, I mean, if you live in Australia, you know some Kiwis. You know, they're just everywhere. So there's one area. Christchurch is a city in New Zealand, and there's one area on the Gold Coast. Its nickname is Little Christchurch. There are so many people from New Zealand living there. Right. So there's a close association between the two countries, but they still maintain their independence, which is perhaps the best arrangement.
Yeah. Now, sticking to that geological sort of bent here, so in the United States, this is kind of unserious subject, but you know, the cultures in different states tend to be pretty obvious. I think attitudes kind of differ and everything. Is it similar for Australia? It's like all the states kind of different in culture. Kind of you can tell somebody comes from here or there.
Yes, but not as much as it used to be, and not as much as and definitely not as much as the US. Having lived in North America, I spent quite a bit of time in the US and had the opportunity to visit a number of states. And you're absolutely right. There's really quite significant distinctions culturally between the states. And I noticed tend to be a lot of loyalty to a state as well. So we did have that in Australia. Prior to 1901, they were independent colonies, and they actually had tariffs between the colonies on the Australian continent.
Tariffs between the colonies, okay.
Tariffs between the colonies. So Queensland, there was Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria, South Australia, Western Australia, and Tasmania were the 6 colonies. And they had tariffs. And notably, Queensland produces sugarcane. South Australia used to produce sugar beet, which was an actual beet, like a beet that you can get sugar from. But the beet from sugar beet is not as good as the sugar you get from sugarcane. Yeah. And when Federation happened, all the tariffs were abolished immediately. There was no transitional period. The sugar beet industry in South Australia was wiped out overnight because everybody in South Australia suddenly wanted Queensland sugarcane. Yeah. That was so much. It was cheaper and a superior product, or maybe not cheaper, but it was close enough that it was a superior product that was worth buying.
Right.
So
that's understandable.
Yeah. So Australians used to be quite parochial when it came to their state of origin, but it's not really so much anymore. And in fact, most people live in multiple states during their life now. So it's good. Now, there are some differences, though. I live in Queensland, which is still one of the more conservative states. And we haven't bought into woke here quite as badly as, say, Victoria, where I was born.
Okay, because I was about to ask about the political inclinations and the social, because it's kind of well divided here in the United States. So.
Absolutely. So it's not nearly as much, but and people move around. Particularly North Americans coming here often amazed at the amount the Australians move between states. But yeah, it is still there though, and so I am happy, even though I am not myself a conservative. I'm actually kind of happy that I'm living in a state that's got a little bit more of shielding from the woke. So
yeah, exactly. Yeah, know exactly what you mean. Yeah.
And we held ICMI, I was going to say, we held ICMI 17 in Queensland partly for that reason as well.
That's completely understandable. I should get an education on Australian geography if ICMI were to ever happen there again.
Well, ICMI 25. So maybe we'll see you in Australia in 2025.
I hope so.
Which is only 2 years away now.
Yeah.
So I'm planning that. I'm actually going to start planning it soon. I'm going to leave plenty. I'm going to basically be planning a lot of it early this time. And I've got an idea for the venue. For those who don't know, ICMI 20 was supposed to be in Sydney, and it all fell apart as a result of the pandemic, as so much else did. Ended up being an online conference, which was fantastic, by the way. The 20 and 21 went really well. But anyway, ICMI 25 will be in Sydney.
Okay, switching subjects. You've got, so I'm assuming this is pronounced Rouge Ignatova?
Yes. I've only found out about Rouge Ignatova recently. So Rouge seems to have had a bit of a history of scams, but managed to pull off perhaps one of the biggest scams of all time, something called OneCoin, where she basically drove up this cryptocurrency, or what it was claimed to be a cryptocurrency. Apparently it really wasn't, though. Apparently it didn't actually use blockchain technology. It was basically a Ponzi scheme, for what I understand. Anyway, old Rouge disappeared in, I think, 2017, 2018, somewhere around there. And I actually find it kind of impressive that somebody can stay hidden in the modern world, especially someone whose picture is so widely distributed. She's managed to stay hidden for years.
Yeah,
but she's wanted. I think in the US, she's on the now top 10 or something like that, the FBI wanted list. So it's really quite impressive that she's managed to stay hidden as long as she has. But yes, so that's. I only just found out about Rouge recently, so I thought she was worth mentioning. She's going to get herself a Wiki for Men entry. Now, the reason I put these women on Wiki for Men is because the women are wonderful effect is still so widespread that people keep claiming that women are morally superior to men and so forth, and I think that if we start seeing more of the truth, which is that there are a lot of female offenders, and they're often they're doing these sort of quite large scams as well. So we'll bring some more truth to the situation.
Exactly, and in a way, they seem kind of few and far between, which is probably not true, but they can really get away with it if they were a woman. They're much more effective operators, I think.
Absolutely, the judicial system we know favors women at every stage, and that includes police investigation. So that absolutely does favor them. Yeah. So one thing I'll note, Google, we know with men's rights, the Google algorithms are really pretty bad in terms of biases and so forth. I have to say, Bing, now I'm not saying there aren't biases, Bing is an alternative search engine to Google, Bing seems to be a lot less biased. Now, I do a lot of searching on female offenders, right? Mm-hmm. And Bing has picked this up and routinely presents them to me now. And I think there are plenty that I would otherwise miss, but Bing is quite happy to present me a list of female offenders when presenting news articles and so forth. So I'm able to then take those quite easily and make Wiki for Men articles out of them.
Yeah, sure. Bing doesn't really come up that much. Yeah.
No, it's only got a relatively small share of the search market compared to Google. Mm-hmm. Still larger than Dogpile and a few others. But I do think, I'm not saying there aren't biases, but they seem to be a lot less severe than with Google. Yeah. So I'm favouring Bing.
Okay. Right. Now, since you're bringing up a female fraudster, I think one of the most arguably well-known ones. So you know the case with Elizabeth Holmes and Theranos, right?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah, it's probably one of the first things that came up in my head, right? Yeah, I mean, I know she was kind of trending a little bit. I don't know if there's any new developments and anything like that. I know that this is an interesting case, like almost an exception in which nobody's really kind of supporting her so much, Yeah, right.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There does seem to be a limit to gynocentrism. That's there've been a number of cases recently where we've seen, I think, women who would ordinarily get a lot of support, they've kind of stepped over the line, like Elizabeth Holmes is a perfect example, where it's so bad that nobody can support her, despite the fact that she's a woman.
Exactly. But thinking on the women are wonderful effect that you were mentioning before, like before she was exposed, that women were a wonderful effect was in place, because she was getting this, oh, look at this female entrepreneur really doing a real breakthrough or anything like that, and she was getting all this attention, and and as it turns out,
Exactly, and I think that probably did play at least some part of the fact that she's not just a woman but an attractive young woman, I think, too, and that really plays into that sort of innocence that a lot of people do tend to see, particularly with attractive young women.
Exactly.
So Peter Wright has done some great work. Peter Wright, who we both know, has done some great work in terms of researching the medieval period and so forth, and what you see actually is this all starts to appear in the medieval period, this what we would now call the women are wonderful effect. Medieval Europeans basically just assumed that women were morally superior to men. And it's interesting actually, because this is something that, say, many feminists would argue this was a period when women were being oppressed. But in actual fact, the mainstream view was that women were less corruptible than men, for example, which is something that I would personally take issue with. I don't think it's actually true. But in terms of the medieval period, this was the normal situation. They also believe that women wanted sex more than men, by the way. So, which has actually been a fairly common thing throughout.
They believe they wanted it.
Yes. They actually believe too that married women would become physically ill if they didn't get sex regularly.
Okay.
So, but it's the idea that men want sex a lot more than women is actually a relatively recent idea. Our society is even probably a little bit of an outrider in that regard in terms of maintaining that position. Yeah, a lot of societies historically have maintained that women wanted more sex than men.
I see. But was that the same time when sex was more seen as this kind of worst thing that it actually is?
So, medieval Europeans did have probably what could be described as an interesting view of sex. It is interesting, though. So they had something called the marital debt, and the marital debt actually worked both ways. Each partner had an obligation to sexually satisfy the other partner. So either partner could basically ask for sex and the other one had to provide it. But there was an interesting case, and I've got this recorded on Wiki for Men, where there was a religious figure. I don't think he was actually a priest, though, although priests could marry for a while. So priests, it hasn't always been the case that say Catholic priests couldn't marry, but I don't think this gentleman was actually a priest. Anyway, his problem was that he was trying to figure out how to sexually satisfy his wife without sexually satisfying himself. Because he said he felt that in order to maintain his own purity, he had to avoid sex. But he's still stuck because he had to sexually satisfy his wife. And he struggled with this for a while. He wrote about it. And he actually ended up coming up with some suggestions and so forth, basically, which, so basically amounted to him not ejaculating is what it amounted to. But anyway, this was the type of thing that medieval Europeans actually talked about and even struggled with. So, yes, they did see they had a problem with sex in some ways, and that he was actually trying to deny himself pleasure. But at the same time, he wanted to sexually satisfy his wife. Right.
But this is because of the marital debt, as you'd say.
Exactly. It was because of the marital debt. Exactly. That's right. Which in his mind, was something when in conflict with his own need or desire to avoid sex for himself. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Which presumably meant he never asked his wife for sex, but she asked him for sex.
I see. Yeah. That makes sense. Now, I'm assuming it's for like religious reasons or something, some kind of idea that the less sex you have, the more superior you are, I think. Is that?
And yet they had well, I think so. There was certainly, and the Catholic Church, even when priests were allowed to marry, discouraged the marrying. But nevertheless, they maintained that sex within marriage was fine and even encouraged. But there was this sort of, I think this, at the same time, there was this somewhat negative view of it at times. So, but particularly it seems from more often, as I said, with regard to the men experiencing pleasure from sex, which is interesting. Have you ever heard of the venerable bead?
Venerable bead?
The venerable bead.
Oh, I don't think so, no.
No, if you're not a history geek, probably not. The venerable bead was an Anglo-Saxon monk from 8th century. And he lived in Northumbria in northern England. He actually wrote quite a lot about English history. A lot of what we know about the early English history comes from the Venerable Bede. And even though in some cases he was writing 200-300 years after the events, it's still a lot closer than anybody else. But what's interesting is, now as a monk, even when the early Christian church discouraged or had allowed priests to marry, it was generally the case that monks were not supposed to marry.
Mm-hmm.
But this even seems to have not been well enforced, or at least in some parts of the Christian world, maybe just the message didn't get through. And we know, for example, that some Irish monks were married and so forth. Venerable Bede mentions having a wife twice in his writings, and he almost never mentions anything about himself. And he actually mentions in one of the two mentions is actually him basically saying that his having to have sex with his wife keeps him from prayer. He seems to have been complaining about it. But a lot of people have tried to claim that it was metaphorical, that he was talking about the church being his wife or something. I've read those passages over and over, and it doesn't seem like a metaphor to me. So I encourage everybody to find those passages, which are widely available online and they're on Wiki for Men. Read them, and you decide for yourself whether you think they're metaphorical or not. I'm 100% convinced Bede had a wife.
Okay.
Right? Right. And a lot of purists really hate this, because the idea that monks in the 8th century, as I said, they probably weren't supposed to. Rome didn't want them to have wives, but probably he was way up in Northumbria. I don't think the message got through for a while that you weren't supposed to have a wife. So it's quite possible a number of the monks did. So anyway, I encourage everyone to read it and judge for yourself, but I think he had a wife. So it's interesting. He hardly ever mentions anything about himself, but he mentions his wife twice. Interesting.
Yeah.
So, yes, be your own judge on that one, but I'd love it. I've got one more item I was going to mention, unless you've got something else you want to jump in with.
Let's do one more for me. And I think I have one thing I want to bring up. So,
all right. So there's a gentleman who I've been on Twitter since 2014 actually, but I've only become really active recently. I used to just retweet things from associates and so forth, but especially since Elon Musk has taken over, I've decided that I like the free speech angle. So to be clear, I agree with Elon Musk on some things and not other things.
Sure.
I like what he's done with Twitter. I don't think everyone should have to be in the office. I think working from home is a smart way to work, and I think it's probably more efficient in a lot of cases. Yes. But I do like what he's done with the free speech angle. So I'm on Twitter a lot more now. Anyway, there's a gentleman who I've become aware of as a result of my being on Twitter more actively. His name's Phil Mitchell. He's a male sexual abuse specialist. He's been doing some really good stuff, posting some really interesting information on Twitter. And he found in particular a paper, which he just posted actually a couple of hours ago, where the paper talks about the term toxic masculinity, and they were surveying what the wider community thinks of the term. And according to this study, which I'll be putting up on A Voice for Men shortly, it seems that the wider community don't like the term and recognise that it's really quite a negative thing to be saying to young men. So I think that, which I found to be really heartening, the fact that I think the message is getting out there that that's not an okay way. As I said, and I said this on Twitter, the term toxic masculinity is toxic.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. And the real toxic one, the gynocentric one, they'd be for it. So
yeah, that's right.
Exactly. But yeah, Phil Mitchell, he's someone we'd like to get on our show someday, right? I mean,
yes.
Yeah, if we can get in touch with him, because he's pretty well popular. He's doing a lot in exposing misandry and calling out people who would deny them. He's pretty active, and I've been following him for some time.
Yeah. No, that's doing some good stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And you had something.
Well, something that's a buzz recently is this. I don't know if you've paid attention to this. I probably haven't paid attention to it as well as I should have, but there was this whole contract deal between Daily Wire and Steven Crowder kind of falling apart, and this big discussion about it. I don't know if you've paid attention to that too much.
No, I haven't been paying attention to that at all. Go ahead.
Well, so other people can kind of describe this better than myself, but this is my understanding about it. The Daily Wire offered a deal to Steven Crowder, and Crowder rejected it. And as it turns out, the contract was absolute bogus. And and they raised this kind of there's been kind of drama brewing up, and Shapiro, because we're such big fans of Shapiro, right? He's basically kind of called out Crowder publicly on this for some not even well, of course he's not going to be completely honest about how bullshit the terms of the contract were. Basically, if Crowder were to do content for the Daily Wire, basically Daily Wire would have virtually all rights to it, if not completely all rights to it.
Oh,
I think that's my understanding of it. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong. I haven't really. I don't consider myself a huge fan of either. Most certainly not a Daily Wire. That's why I've been kind of not been paying attention to it. But it's been there's been some buzz.
That's actually interesting, because that's the type of terms you would see something, say, an unknown or something publishing, and generally the terms would be very favourable towards the publishing organisation. But for somebody already with a fairly well known, it's surprising that terms like that were the terms agreed to.
Oh, no. Crowder rejected it, and that's where this big drama has been happening. Yeah, and everybody's been kind of going, "Oh, which side are you on, a Daily Wire or Crowder?" And all things considered, I think I would be on Crowder's side. But again, I'm not horribly a fan of either side, really. But
yeah, I'm surprised they would approach a well-known figure with those sort of terms. So, in contrast. If you put anything on Wiki for Men, you retain copyright to the any information. So if anyone wants to put anything on Wiki for Men, which is under a Creative Commons license, you retain copyright to your material, and you can republish it anywhere you like under a different license. So just in case anyone feels they want to add anything to Wiki for Men, I want to make those terms very, very clear.
Right.
So anyway, yes. So that's probably all I had for tonight.
Well, I'm thinking of one more thing. It's a bit of a frivolous one, but it's actually kind of interesting. This is one point where the non-woke might be in over their heads, and people are complaining about Pink Floyd now.
Okay.
Yeah, because they had this 50th anniversary of Dark Side of the Moon, right? Because I'm assuming you know Pink Floyd, of course.
Yes, of course.
Goodness knows, a certain Paul Elam is a huge Pink Floyd guy. I'd love to hear his thoughts on this, but there are some non-woke people that are complaining about the rainbow in the artwork.
Okay, does it predate, or how long have they been using it?
It's the rainbow has been part of that album cover from the start,
right?
Like that's like the 70s, right? Yeah. So. And now, now that the 50th anniversary, just because there's a rainbow in the cover.
Oh, I see.
They think it's some kind of woke virtue signaling or something. And, they just don't understand Pink Floyd. It's not this woke thing. The rainbow's always been there. It's that whole prism thing. Yeah, it's been there from the start.
I guess my response would be something that has been coming up a lot lately, and this is something I say to the woke a lot. Context is important. Mm-hmm. So if obviously it was a different context in which they did that cover album 50 years ago, and yes, that's right. It makes sense. I tend to agree. It would make sense to leave the original cover in place. In fact, people will probably like that from a nostalgia point of view.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes. Context is everything. Context is important.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's really all I got for myself. This is probably not a very long episode, if this is all we've got. Anything else?
No, I don't think so. That's everything. As on a personal note, as I promised, I think I commented in an earlier episode, I'm spending more time on the beach. So I live relatively close to the beach, and I hadn't been going to the beach much for the last few years until I made a point on New Year's Eve. Wasn't a New Year's Eve resolution, but I decided on New Year's Eve that I would be spending more time on the beach, and I've been sticking to it. So having a great time.
That's good. Yeah. Doing any surfing at all, or
what's that? Sorry.
Doing any surfing at all?
No, more just walking on the beach. Actually, but I've been finding I've been walking for further and longer than I meant to, which is good. It's been good exercise anyway. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I haven't been to a beach really since since I was a kid in Japan. You'd think I'd be in the beach more often living in Florida, of all places. But I haven't gone to the beach at all. It just never came up.
So, same sort of thing here in Australia. You think, oh, especially living relatively close to the beach, we go to the beach all the time. Sometimes it doesn't work out that way. But as I said, I was New Year's Eve and I was standing on the jetty and the crashing waves and went, you know what? I'm going to spend more time on the beach. Yes.
Yeah. If it was right here, I probably would too.
So I highly recommend it. I don't know how. Actually, I'm not sure how close you are to the beach, but if you're within reasonable distance, I'd highly recommend it.
We're kind of dead center of the center of Florida. So,
right. Okay. Yep. Yes. I've actually spent a bit of time in Florida too, so so I got a bit of an idea of the geography. So, but all right, wonderful. I'll talk to you soon.
Yeah, sure. 2 weeks.
Yes, sounds good. Bye bye.